Hi, I'm Stan Brakhage again. I want to play you some flute music today in the spirit of continuing that tradition, the last two programs, first of all with the Greek music of Kekes, and then last week with Edgar Varèse's Density 21.5. I have a tape that I dug out of the basement here that Allen Ginsberg gave me sometime back in the 60s. I was having trouble listening to Indian music at the time, and about all that was available was Ravi Shankar. And Alan, back from India, told me that Ravi Shankar was more or less considered the Frank Sinatra of India. And so he promised to send me some Indian music that would intrigue me. And the piece that he sent that I'm going to play a section of is flute music by Pannalal Ghosh. And so here it is. Now, of course, Pannalal Ghosh is a modern man, but that music is in a tradition that's, probably close to 1,000 years older than the Greek. And at least, as I told you in the first broadcast, there's a reference in poetry a long time before there's any mention of what we've come to know as the pipes of Pan. In fact, there's also Melanesian legends about the origin of music with the flute. The story is that once the wind was blowing through a branch of a tree, and it scared all the women. And the men said, "At last we have a way to scare the women." And they cut off the branch and began blowing in it. And that's the Melanesian origin for music. But in case some of you are feeling that, for instance, the drive of the dramatist Eugene O'Neill to turn the whole stage into a brain, or the drive of Edgar Varese, as we heard with electronic music, to give some approximation of mental processes with recorded sound mixed with music. That piece that we just began this program with is called Inward, and that's been a drive always in human endeavor in the arts. So what then might we mean by modernity? I have a quote here from Charles Baudelaire, the French poet, from his book, The Painter of Modern Life. Quote, "Modernity is that which is ephemeral, fugitive, contingent upon the occasion. It is half of art, whose other half is the eternal and unchangeable." Now that seems to me a very good example of European view of it. The point at which American artists, as I understand it, would feel most emphasis there would be contingent upon the occasion, or something of present. But you notice, as Baudelaire has that, it would have something to do also with the unchangeable and the past. And I would say that the basic American impulse starts with the moment and then branches out with ideas about the future. For example, a letter by, I don't have very clear ways to represent painting over the radio, but I want to read a letter from the young, in fact 18-year-old Jackson Pollock to his brother. Sections of a letter. Quote, "As to what I would like to be, it is difficult to say. An artist of some kind. If nothing else, I shall always study the arts. People have always frightened and bored me. Consequently, I've been within my own shell and have not accomplished anything materially. In fact, to talk in a group, I was so frightened that I could not speak logically. I am gradually overcoming it now." End quote. Now that's just seems so strange when you think of the paintings of Jackson Pollock, which were finally, as what he became famous for, premised on giving the energy of the moment, the act itself of creation and making, by hurling paint through the air, which, by the way, as I witnessed myself, he was so capable of doing to perfection that once, when some critics accused him of chance operations, though he was pretty drunk at the time, he dabbled his brush into a bucket and hurled a glob of paint so carefully across 50 feet that it hit the doorknob square with very little paint spilled over. And then he said, "So much for your chance operations, and that's the door." It was, in fact, the only door that they could leave through. Another letter by Jackson Pollock, a section from it, written in 1930, a year later, to his brother Charles. Quote, "School is still boresome, but I have settled myself to its rules and the ringing bells, so I have not been in trouble lately. This term I am going to go but 1/2 day. The rest I will spend reading and working here at home. I'm quite sure I will be able to accomplish a lot more. In school I will take life drawing and clay modeling. I've started doing something with clay and have found a bit of encouragement from my teacher. My drawing, I will tell you frankly, is rotten. It seems to lack freedom and rhythm. It is cold and lifeless. It isn't worth the postage to send it. I think there should be advancement soon, if it is ever to come, and then I will send you some drawings. The truth of it is, I have never really gotten down to real work and finish a piece. I usually get disgusted with it and lose interest. Watercolor I like, but have never worked with it much. Although I feel I will make an artist of some kind, I have never proven to myself, nor anybody else, that I have it in me. What I want to, in that spirit, play next is, first of all, I want to present to you something of one of the students of Edgar Varèse. He's a Chinese student. He'd come to this country. Chou Wen-Chung is his name. I met him at the time when Jim Tenney and I were both studying with Varèse. He was very quiet, very polite, very exact, and extremely lyric. And there's one piece of his music that's haunted me all my life. Actually, the only use the society has made of it is on a record, curiously enough, that was put out of the music of Edward Grieg and Manuel de Falla. And as an insert on this record, a Vox recording, came a record of Deems Taylor explaining both Grieg and de Falla to the listener. And we'll start hearing the voice of Deems Taylor. He's been talking about composers drawing on folk music. And then he says a little bit about jazz at the beginning. Then he curiously goes out of his way to give the only recording of this piece of music by this Chinese student of Edgar Varèse, Chou Wen-Chung. So be patient with Mr. Taylor for a couple of minutes.
The other of the two sources for this kind of American music is, of course, jazz. It should be pointed out that there are many serious jazz composers who are broadening and deepening that style as an art in itself. When it is used as a basis for concert works, however, the process becomes analogous to the adaptation of folk music. It is interesting to see that composers from the Far East are adapting the music of their countries to Western musical systems. This is to be distinguished from the many treatments of Eastern music by Western musicians. The contemporary Chinese composer, Chou Wen-Chung, who now lives in the United States, has provided a beautiful example in his suite for harp and winds. Of these various examples.
So far as I know, that's a whole piece of music. It's the only part of that music that I ever heard. I asked Jim years later whatever happened to this young man, and he told me that his fiancée died. I remember her too, an extraordinarily beautiful Chinese girl, and how close they were. And that so far as Jim knew, this had been so crushing a blow on him that he had never composed any other music. I hope that's not true across a lifetime for him. His idea was to make very brief, short pieces of music. Maybe he had gone on under some pressures and extended this, I don't know. But I do remember just that piece of tape. And as it happened, it turned up because my father-in-law, Harry Collum, was sensitive enough to remember the name, and when he got this record and surprised at this piece of Chinese music on this explanatory record, small record included with it, he gave it to me. That's happened a lot to me in my life, where very small, minuscule artworks haunt, and sometimes one never hears of the composer, or in the case of painting, painter, or poet, or filmmaker, or whatever, ever again. I wanted also to take the occasion to say something about the Chinese impulse of inwardness. I have a statement here by the Chinese poet Wang Yung. He was born in 1936. In modern times, this is quote, in modern times, eternity has acquired a new definition. It is no longer the community of endless time, but extreme perfection and fullness. Poetry, in modern times, does not search for the inaccessible permanence and universality. It aims at the release of its character. Now, this poet, with that statement, I should say, end quote there, this poet, with that statement, actually places an impulse that exists, at least in him, in China, very close to Jackson Pollock and to the next composer's music that I want to play for you. And that's some music by my old high school buddy, Jim Tenney, who discovered Edgar Varese at about the same time I did because of early recordings that somehow got to Denver, and that shocked and astonished us. Jim Tenney did the music for the first film that I made, and then later we met in New York City, and both of us searched out Edgar Varese and John Cage, by the way, at the same time. And Tenney studied for years with Varese, and in fact, at Varese's death, he named Jim Tenney his, quote, only musical heir. And as you'll hear for yourself, that doesn't mean he's imitative. In fact, he did work for some time with electronic music, Jim did, and in fact made the first setup for synthesizing sound at Bell Labs, a job that he got through Edgar Varese's influence. But then he returned to orchestral music, and what I want to play for you now is a piece made sometime between 1972 and 76 in Toronto, Canada. This is the first section of what's called 3 Pieces for Drum, Quartet. You have to be a little patient at first, and then it'll be worth it. It's maybe hardest of all to recognize when a genius in the arts or anything else is someone that you've grown up with, in a sense, or that is a close friend, or that you might have one living next door or even in your family. So that probably the deepest suspicions are reserved in myself for friends that I've known as long as Jim. But he's convinced me, finally, just as he did Edgar Varese. I want to give you an example also of his continued working with electronic devices, and as well his interest in folk music, so to speak. The next piece that I'm going to play is by Jim Tenney also then. It's called Blue Suede, and it's based upon the ever-popular blue suede shoes. So listen carefully, and maybe you'll hear the internal mind chewing over this. Maybe you'll really hear some folk, if you'll pardon the expression, music. And from all us folks, this is Stan Brakhage signing off with Charles Ives.